Hello and welcome to the WorldView with me, Ramakrishnan Sridharan. Today we have very special guest, Bran Black, who's the Chief Executive of Business Council of Australia, perhaps the most important business association in Australia. Bran, welcome to the WorldView.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bran, if you were to look at the Indo-Pacific region and and try to figure out what has been the most significant story in terms of bilateral relations, I guess we'll have to come to the conclusion that it's perhaps India and Australia. Because I think in the last 10 years, we've gone from maybe I don't like you that much to, hey baby, I'm falling in love with you kind of a situation here. So, and this is just the beginning, because if you look at the bilateral trade, it just like rocketed. Now we do about 48 billion, and there are estimates we're going to touch 100 billion in less than 5 years. But clearly this is just the beginning. What do you have to say?
Look, I think that's such a great way of describing it. I do like to think of the relationship as a love story. We do have so much potential as between Australia and India from an economic standpoint. You know, when you look at the existing trade, as you say, for India, for Australia, India is the 6th largest trading market, and as you say, it's at 50 billion in two-way trade. But there is so much more scope for growth in that regard. Your economic growth story is just unbelievable, 6.8% growth a year. And as we see it, with a growing middle class, 400 million right now, moving up to around 1 billion by the middle of the century, right, that scope for growth is just extraordinary.
Okay, so what are the sectors that excite you? You know, you have a very unique perch. You're at the very top of the business groups in Australia. So what are the sectors that's exciting, let's say, Australian businesses?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because what it goes directly to is the relationships that we've put together, the Business Council of Australia, and with CII as well. And we've been really grateful for the relationship that we have with them, that sees businesses come together and pick those sectors and those areas that they regard as having the most potential. So in that regard, we're looking at agribusiness, we're looking at education, we're looking at energy resources and critical minerals, infrastructure and partnerships, and of course the digital economy. And I stress, these are all sectors that have been identified by business leaders on both sides, so on the Indian side and on the Australian side. And what those leaders are saying is, let's work together, let's break down some of the barriers that sometimes arise in the context of trade and investment relationships, and let's see what we can do to promote prosperity in both countries.
Mm-hmm. So green tech is an important area of focus for India, because as a country, as we grow, we need cleaner sources of energy. We can't keep relying on fossil fuel. What sort of an opportunity specifically do you see in the green tech area?
Well, let me start by taking a little bit of a step back. For a start, we've got the capacity to continue to provide traditional sources of energy as
coal.
Indeed, as India's economic growth story develops. And we know that the need for coal, by way of example, is going to increase by about 5% a year for India, at least for the next 10 years. So there's that. But in terms of the transition to renewables, as we see it, there are lots of different areas in which we can provide support and strength from an Australian perspective. One, for example, is research excellence. So if you take the east coast of Australia, we've got universities, by way of example, the University of New South Wales, the University of Wollongong, the University of Newcastle. All of those have great strength and expertise, and my understanding is that there are over 400 partnerships between Australian universities and India already. So using those partnerships to develop the research is one important way in which we can assist. The other, of course, is through funding and investment. Our investment banks and our superannuation funds are interested in that regard. But then there is the actual work of the transition itself. And we've already got a number of different partnerships that have been established that I think hold enormous potential to be developed further in green hydrogen, green steel, and of course with solar. As the Indian economy develops and as it greens, as we head towards that transition, it's those areas that I think have the most potential.
Great, sounds good. In terms of business, we've seen that our trade numbers have really exploded over the last 2 years. We've grown at almost 50% year on year. Probably that's courtesy the economic cooperation and trade agreement that we signed. But there's a bigger deal that we are like working on together as a country, which is the comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. How do you rate the progress right now? What are the hurdles maybe you see that are still in the way? And how hopeful are you of this getting sealed maybe this year or next?
Well, we're extremely hopeful that it will be signed soon. And what we'd like to do is encourage businesses that will benefit from this type of free trade relationship to encourage governments to work together in order to resolve any issues that are still being worked through. But it's really quite important to note what's already been done. So with the ECTA, which exists already, certainly from an Australian perspective, 85% of exports are already tariff-free, and that'll rise to 90% on the 1st of January 2026. At that point, 100% of Indian exports to Australia will be tariff-free. So there's already so many important steps that have been taken. And remember, of course, that this was India's first free trade agreement. So making sure that we capitalise on the existing momentum that's been achieved and use that as a basis for driving forward new momentum to finalise the deal, that's really important to us. And what I've seen over the last few days here in Delhi, but also in Bengaluru, is that there's been enormous support and enormous encouragement for this process. So as I say, we need our business leaders, myself included, to be working with our politicians and our governmental leaders to make sure this is a priority.
Okay, so we're in the middle of an election. There's a new government that should be in place by middle of June. So would you suggest to the new government that this should be taken up on priority and signed as quickly as possible?
Absolutely, absolutely. We always say that if it's good things like this, it's just important to get on with them and get them done as quickly as possible. So we'd be encouraging any new government to make this a priority.
Right. So now if I look at Australian businesses per se, Bran, over the last 20 years, we've had about $15 billion of foreign direct investment coming into India. What sort of numbers do you think India could expect over, let's say, the next 10 to 20 years, given that there is some amount of shift that's away from, I would say, your traditional partner as a country, which is China, which is your largest trading partner, to economy slowing down there, so you need to find newer venues. So what kind of investment do you think India could potentially get from Australia?
Well, it's a really great question because it speaks to that enormous potential and indeed the potential that is being realised right now that the Indian economy has. So as I mentioned before, your growth rate is 6.8%, your population 1.4 billion, and our trading relationship now worth 50 billion. You compare that with Australia's relationship with China at the moment, and that's yielding two-way trade between Australia and China of 300 billion a year, and that's for a population of less than India's, but still over 1 billion. So from my perspective, what I'd like to see is as India increases in its size and scope and scale, so too does that really important trading relationship between India and Australia, and that investment relationship too. And the wonderful thing about the experience that I've had over the last few days is that there is such a strong person-to-person connection between Indian businesses and Australian businesses. We really want to make the most of that because we see it's not only good for both countries from a prosperity perspective, it's obvious that the people of both countries enjoy working together. So why not make the most of that? Absolutely,
I think you said it well. So one of the things that's really been booming in this country is the startup space. Bran, if you look at it, we spawned hundreds of startups, and quite a few of them are actually unicorns, which is more than $1 billion in valuation. So what sort of opportunity do you think Australia provides to Indian startup, we talked about women startup earlier. What kind of opportunity do you think it's available for Indian startups to come and do things in Australia?
I think there's enormous potential, and I'd break that into a couple of different spaces if I can. First, there's the existing opportunity, and there's always the chance to enhance and capitalise on that. So there are Indian startups that are operating and supporting Australian IT businesses, financial services businesses, other businesses in the digital economy. But then you've got to look towards those sectors that have been identified by the CEO Forum as having priority. So again, I go back to agri-tech, education, infrastructure partnerships, energy and critical minerals and so on. But beyond that, and this is the exciting bit, it's important to look at the needs of the Australian economy moving forward. So we have an ageing population, by way of example. There is an increased need for healthcare and finding efficiencies. So that's an area where Indian startups could play a role. More broadly, what Australia needs to do is really focus on its economic growth and how we can start to drive productivity. So my message to anybody in the Indian startup space, who's interested in working in Australia is where you can help businesses right across the board in Australia find those productivity savings, generate efficiencies. That's the golden goose, if you will, and that's what we're all looking to achieve.
So is there any startup incubator kind of a program that already exists in Australia, or is it something that BCA would want to consider, especially for Indian startups?
We're always really happy to talk to companies that are interested in coming into the country, and we're always really happy to help facilitate contacts and connections that they're looking to develop. What we have is a number of different startup incubators that are particularly apparent in the universities. We've seen increasingly across so many different Australian universities that they have designated startup programs, that they help facilitate people's thinking around how they can get ideas from paper to commercialisation and making a genuine chance of having these types of ideas. That already happens in the university sector, and we're very pleased to be in a position to encourage that wherever we can.
Okay. I also wanted to ask you about the Australia Innovation Network, which has been set up by the two countries. It's meant to accelerate innovation together in partnership with the two countries. How do you rate the progress at the ground level? Do you see a lot of action, or if not, what more can be done?
Look, I think with the Innovation Network, the critical thing is to note it's set up by government. So it's a government-to-government arrangement, and of course it facilitates business-to-business connections. But from my perspective, and certainly what I've seen over the last few days, what I want to concentrate on and what the Business Council is interested in is that person-to-person engagement, which is facilitating so much change and so much engagement between the two countries. So by way of example, in Bengaluru, we had the opportunity to visit the offices of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Telstra, and also ANZ. And what was clear there is that what's made a big difference in terms of their approach, becoming integral to the operations of large Australian companies, is that person-to-person linkage has been so strong. So when you've got that person-to-person connection, you're in a position to say to people that you're working with in Australia, hey, we've got the potential to develop this particular product, which is going to provide this additional service. That's the type of arrangement that we're looking to facilitate. That person-to-person link is so strong.
Absolutely. So I also understand that one of the reasons why you're visiting is also to basically add some wind under the India-Australia CEO Forum led by Jody McKay, who's a great friend of India. Everyone loves her in India. So what exactly will the new forum or the summit that you're trying to do, what will be the objective of that, and how will it strengthen the relationship between the business relationships between the two countries?
Well, I can't talk about this, to your point, without mentioning Jody, and she's been absolutely sensational in terms of driving forward what is such an important program for both countries. But to give a bit of context, the forum was set up in 2012, but really given a push along by both Prime Ministers, Modi and Albanese, back in 2023. So since then, on the Australian side, Jodie's been leading the progression of various different recommendations across those key areas that I identified before that have been selected by CEOs. That's the critical thing about the forum. It's not as though government's leading it. It's not as though the Business Council of Australia on its own is leading it, or that CII is leading it. It's you've got CEOs coming together and saying, these are the areas of focus that we have identified, and what's more, we want to make our recommendations practical. So we've had so many different working discussions, all at the CEO level. They've produced a series of working papers, but a series of important recommendations as well, more than 50. Now those recommendations are going to be considered by co-chairs over the course of the next few weeks. And once we've got a finalised set of recommendations, that's when the hard work starts. I'm a big fan of saying that vision without delivery is just a hallucination. And what I mean by that is that in this particular context, the hard work is really just getting started. So there'll be some things that governments can get on with, policy levers that can be pulled or pushed as needed. But beyond that, what we're going to need is for both business organisations, CII and the Business Council to progress other initiatives that require practical push on a day-to-day basis, like work-integrated learning and research partnerships, by way of example.
Okay, so you mentioned some key recommendations. Would you just give me a sense of some of the 3 or 4 most important recommendations that have been made to strengthen the business relations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there are recommendations in relation to banking and investment, which are really key so that we can reduce some of the barriers in that space. But just to touch upon what I was looking at before in terms of work-integrated learning and research, that's an area that I'd really like to stress because we have great strength already in the relationship between India and Australia. We have 120,000 Indian students in Australia, but importantly, we've got 2 Australian universities that have set up campuses in India. That's Deakin University and the University of Wollongong. There is so much more potential for us to do more work in that space, and it fits in with some of the strategies that Australia is looking to drive. So increased research collaboration between industry and between universities. That's not just a matter for Australia to consider. What the CEO Forum is saying is let's do that work together. The same goes for work-integrated learning. Where can we find opportunities for Australian and Indian companies to have that type of engagement that produces work-integrated learning opportunities for students? And one point that I might just mention is that we had this wonderful opportunity just yesterday to sign an MOU with CII in relation to the Women's Leadership Forum. And this directly links in with the type of exchange programs and facilitation work that we've been looking to do through the CEO Forum more broadly. What that will lead to is exchange programs between Indian companies and Australian companies that facilitate learning opportunities across both countries. We're really excited by that, but it speaks to that type of partnership.
Great, that sounds wonderful. On a larger point, Bran, if you look at the strategic shift, the geopolitical shift that's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia is not just looking at India, but also the neighboring countries as a group to do things. So from a business point of view, what do you think are the implications? Because we are not really, although we are contiguous, we are close by, we are not really one common market. So from a business perspective, how do you look at this whole approach?
It's a really interesting question. From a business perspective, we always see that our role is to operate within the parameters that are set by governments at a diplomatic level. So we don't get involved in the politics or the diplomacy. Our role is to facilitate the best possible business-to-business engagement in any jurisdiction. You know, we're very lucky, I think, in Australia to have positive relationships with China, with the United States, with countries in our region in Southeast Asia, and of course with India. And India is such an important market for us. So we are privileged to be in a strong position in terms of our Australian to Indian relationships. And what's very clear from my perspective, certainly in terms of talking to the CEOs that I speak to on a daily basis in Australia, is that they are very keen on working with India, not just because it's a commercial opportunity, but because they enjoy the engagement that they get with Indian CEOs and with Indian staff members.
Right. So moving to another aspect of this whole geopolitical shift, there's obviously some sort of a war going on between the 2 largest economies and the 2 most powerful countries, US and China, for their own reasons. But how is, let's say, the Australian businesses, how are they navigating this whole issue? Because as Australia, you're more aligned to US, right? And, so how are you navigating this whole fight? Because it's going to cut both ways.
It comes down to that very same point. You know, we have, again, very strong relationships with both countries. And from my perspective as the Chief Executive of the Business Council, I see my role as operating within those diplomatic parameters that have been set by government. You know, we were really pleased last year to see that relationships with China are developing further than they have in recent years. And that's led to useful exchanges that have resulted in better trading opportunities for Australian companies. But we have a very strong relationship with the United States, and that facilitates, again, trade, investment opportunity. So for Australia, we look at each relationship very differently, but we look at them as opportunities to work with friends. And to my mind, as a business leader from Australia, what we look to do is maximise the commercial opportunities as between any country with which Australia is trading.
Right. So earlier you mentioned that, with 300 billion in bilateral trade, China is your single largest trading partner. And China has been the largest consumer of everything, pretty much everything, all resources. Now, if China is going to slow down, as the projections are, maybe for the next 5, even 10 years, what sort of implications would it have for Australian businesses, which are the large suppliers of resources to China? You will necessarily need to, find other markets. So, how are you navigating that part?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that China will continue to be a strong consumer of Australian goods and services and commodities for a long period. And that's very clear in terms of the engagement that we have with Australian businesses, but also with Chinese counterparts. But what we're always looking to do is expand opportunity for Australian businesses, and that necessarily means looking at other markets. Now, that's not diversification from a defensive position. That's diversification because it just makes sense from a business perspective. So we're very pleased to have, as I've mentioned before, these great opportunities to work with India and with Indian companies, because we know that potential for growth is right there and it's happening right now. I can't stress enough that 6.8% is such an extraordinary growth figure. In Australia, our growth figure is sitting at about 2%. It has been close to 3 or just over 3% as our long run average. And what we're looking to do is really drive that forward, because in Australia, 1 in 4 jobs is trade related. So for us, having those external relationships, be it with China or Southeast Asia or North America or India, they're so important.
Right. If I look at the world at large, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. On the one hand, we have economies slowing down. On the other hand, consumer inflation is shooting up. US is dealing with it. We are dealing with it. So is Australia. So it's a really treacherous world for businesses to navigate at this point. What would your advice be in terms of how should the businesses, the successful ones, navigate this part of uncertainty that they're dealing with right now?
It's a really interesting question. Back in Australia, we've got challenges in terms of cost of living that I think people are experiencing at the moment.
Yes.
I know that there are many countries all around the world that are experiencing that too. And then, of course, we've got the challenge of making sure that we can continue to grow at the same rate that we have over many years. That's locked in the quality of life that we enjoy in Australia. And when I think about those two challenges, the answer for me is always productivity. So how can we drive productivity? Once you've got productivity, then you reduce the scope for inflation. But you're also, of course, increasing growth, and that's what ultimately makes the difference. So where we can find those opportunities and that scope in commercial relationships for productivity growth, that's excellent. And in an international context, that comes through the different trading relationships that we have. It increases the scope for people to have safe and secure jobs, well-paying jobs, and that's why, for one, it's so important for us to finalise those discussions in relation to CECA, but two, to really work together to find opportunities for Australia to support this extraordinary growth story in India.
Right. So one final question, Bran. This is on the elephant in the room for everyone, which is artificial intelligence. For businesses, obviously, it's a big opportunity because you can use AI to become more efficient, cut costs, eliminate low-end coding, a whole variety of things. But from a people perspective, the ordinary citizen, people who are in the workforce, it's a big threat, potential threat. How are Australian businesses looking at AI? Is it a threat or is it an opportunity? Or how do you walk the fine line between the two?
I think it's such an important issue, and it's one of those issues in Australia that we're grappling with and will continue to grapple with. I think all countries are going to be grappling with this issue over the course of many decades to come as AI programs change, as they develop, as they grow, and as they have the scope to influence what happens in business day to day. We've seen in Australia, by way of example, that there is an advisory group that's been set up by the government to really make sure that we can be responsive and agile in relation to our response to artificial intelligence. We don't want to jump the gun, so to speak, and start regulating before we know what we need to regulate for and where there is already existing regulation that might be able to play an important role. I think this is a really sensible approach. But in terms of the business approach to AI, my conversations with business leaders show that they are taking this very seriously, and they want to make sure that they can lock in the efficiencies and the productivity that comes with artificial intelligence, whilst also making sure that their workers have a secure, sustainable future. And I'll give you an example, and I don't think the CEO of this company would mind me saying so. Dulux, which is an important company that produces paints in Australia, they recently moved to a largely automated operating system, and that's fueled to a large degree by artificial intelligence. Now, when they did that, all of the jobs at the lower end of their operations became redundant straight away. But what they did was that they upskilled every single one of those workers. And what that meant was that all of these workers had the opportunity to retrain, to reskill, to get higher paid jobs that are adding more value to Dulux. And the consequence of that is that Dulux is now operating more efficiently and more profitably. That's a great example, I think, of how AI can augment business operations for the better. And one more thing that I might just mention. I often think of this example. I read an interesting newspaper story a few months back about a university lecturer that said to his students, I'm going to set a question for you and I want you to use AI to answer that question, but then I want you to, in markup, to show me how you've improved what the AI generated answer has given. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about the potential for AI. It's not going to give you the whole answer. It'll make the job that you do a little bit easier, but then it's up to the human to say, how can I improve on this? That's how we think about AI and its potential moving forward.
Right, human and AI, as they say. So, but that's a wonderful story, and very, very heartening to know that companies are coming up with innovative ways to use AI and still retain people. So with that, thank you, Bran. Thank you for being on the WorldView with us on News 9. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.